Good afternoon and welcome. This is our Communicators Track Workshop, What to Do with Unexpected Media Calls. Our presenter today is Jennifer Schack, Director of Media Relations for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. In her role of promoting the Catholic faith, Jennifer has been able to help bring to light not only the great work of the church, but also the deep, enriching spiritual life God is calling each of us to. Her previous career was in TV broadcasting, where she worked for 13 years as a meteorologist and reporter. Jennifer has been on the receiving end of the unexpected calls and knows the work of public relations involves information gathering and navigating the field of assessing when to respond to media and when not to. Her presentation this afternoon will cover working relationships with media partners, mitigating negative media coverage, and working with the media for fair coverage, as well as the research and trust building involved in public relations within your organization. Jennifer will also discuss the ways the media can help us to grow in holiness and Christian virtue. It's my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Schack. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Before we begin, I just wanted to begin with a brief prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Father, creator of unfailing light, give that same light to those who call to you. May our lips praise you, our lives proclaim your goodness, our work give you honor, and our voices celebrate you forever. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Thank you for that introduction. We're going to come back to quite a bit of the experience working in the media in my previous career, and now how it applies to working for the church for the last nearly four and a half to almost 5 years I've been working for the church full-time. So what to do with unexpected media calls? This won't be an all-encompassing talk. There's no way I could tell you exactly why the media is going to be calling you, but we'll explore a couple of broad areas of why they may be calling you and some different strategies for how to respond when they do call. So some of the topics: media calls, media emails, media arrivals at your organization, how to deal with each of those separately. We'll talk through some crisis communication tips if it's a serious situation that needs to be addressed with the media, some things to think about ahead of time. We'll discuss when you should comment and when you should not comment, and how you would not comment, if that's applicable. My philosophy on media relations. I think it's important to start at a really solid ground base level of what the work you're doing is in media relations, so that you come at it with a professional and composed nature about you. Navigating social relationships, that's a new thought process in the world of media relations as we deal with social media and ongoing conversations on social media. When do we and when do we not, your organization, weigh into those conversations? And growing in faith through the work of media relations as well. So I wanted to start with a story to set the tone a little bit for the work of media relations and what it's like on the other side, as in when you're working for the media. As noted, I spent 13 years on television and broadcasting as a television meteorologist. The last 4.5 years working locally here in Cincinnati, which is where I'm from, working for the local NBC affiliate, and that job was half media relations and half reporter. I had not done any reporting. I did not have a journalism degree. I was science and math and meteorology, so very different. But they throw you in like day number 2 and tell you to start reporting. So when I think back of the stories of all, the hundreds of stories I covered, one of the most pertinent, and I think it's applicable for thinking about the world of media relations and the work of reporters and journalists, is the story of searching for snowy owls. I'm going to give you the brief story so you can set the stage. I have some notes here because it's been a couple years. Okay. So each day you're asked to come and pitch your own stories when you're a reporter. Most days I didn't have a story because I wasn't a reporter by nature, and I ended up with whatever they thought would be a good idea. So this day, January 29th, 2014, when I'm about 4.5 months pregnant, I don't have a story, and they read me a press release that the Ohio Division of Wildlife has determined that this winter may have the highest population of snowy owls in Ohio. and they want me to do a story about it because obviously I'm going to become an expert on snowy owls in the next 3 hours, well enough that I can go tell everybody else about snowy owls. Now, and then to note, the Cincinnati viewing area, far north it goes to Butler, Warren, and Clinton counties, Highland, Adams, Brown County to the east. So in all of the Cincinnati viewing area, they had spotted 3 total snowy owls, but yet they wanted me to go see if I could find a snowy owl that day, which is extremely unrealistic. So I get to work making phone calls, which is a big job of what a reporter does. You spend a lot of time on the phone. And I called the Audubon Society of Ohio, I called professors at UC, I called the Greater Cincinnati Bird Club, I called the Cincinnati Zoo, I called bird groups that I found on Facebook, I called anybody related to birds that I could figure out for hours. Hi, I'm Jennifer, I'm talking about snowy owls. Can I come meet you today to talk about snowy owls? Well, nobody wanted to talk to me about snowy owls, but my boss was not going to let me off the hook, and you have to talk to somebody on camera. At that point, now you can do a little more Zoom, which is kind of nice, but you couldn't do that then. You had to go meet them. And I had to figure out where I was going to go take a photographer to film about snowy owls. And it was only about 12 degrees with a wind chill of 2, and it had 2 inches of snow on the ground. I did go back and check that, my meteorology history. I just remember it being cold, but I was kind of curious. So this story goes down in my brain as the idea that a reporter is doing their job when they call you. That's just their job. That you're maybe 1 in a dozen phone calls they made that day because they have to turn something in, and maybe they have to do it in about 2 hours, like I was feet to the fire that day for the snowy owl story. I wish they still had the snowy owl story up on their website, WLWT.com, but they don't, or else I would have played it for you. I ended up, after many hours of phone calls and no definitive interview that I was going to get, my photographer and I went out to Armletter Park, which is near Lunken Airfield here in Cincinnati if you're from here. And apparently that was a well-known place for bird viewing. And we wandered out in the woods in the cold and snow, and we found somebody looking for birds on like a Tuesday at noon. And they were willing to go on camera, thank God. And I got them saying, yeah, I'd love to see a snowy owl. That would be so great. And that's basically all I needed. So, sometimes it's not the end of the world why they're calling or why the media wants your help. We just really needed to get, my boss was not going to be happy unless somebody talked to me about snowy owls. So, now you're probably not getting phone calls about snowy owls, so let's go on about what you may be getting phone calls about. When the media calls, again, they're just doing their job. Let's start with that baseline, that they have a deadline and they have things to accomplish, and they have a boss who's staring at them all afternoon until they get it done. So recognize that they're just doing their job. At the same time, though, you may have a situation at your organization that you do or do not want that information shared publicly. And so you're that bridge between the information of your organization and what should be released and the information the media wants and may not have the rights to or may not be getting from you. But you're going to be the person who is teetering that spot, that relationship between the two groups, and then what becomes public because of that. So let's talk about if the media calls for a situation, but there's lots of different reasons the media may be calling, and these are just a couple of them. I kind of tried to think about them categorically. The first would be a media hot topic. So frequently where every media outlet that day is covering a major water main break, a major storm, a major fire, a robbery in the neighborhood of your organization, something of that nature, which everybody's going to be covering that day, and they're trying to each get their own local angle or somebody to talk locally. That could be why they're calling. A current organizational issue is possible. Maybe you have a former disgruntled employee. Maybe you have a sister who's become nationally known for something. They may be calling for that reason. They may be calling for a historic organization issue. Maybe something new has come to light about the religious group or the organization, and they're tracking it down. Maybe it's negative. Maybe it's a criminal allegation. Maybe it's abuse. Or maybe they're calling for an established story. Something like that would be kind of like the snowy owl, like the press release was sent out, it was out of my control, but it's a story that's out there that they maybe want to connect you to. Or maybe they're calling for good news, that's possible. Maybe you've pitched something to them and they are responding. Or they're also maybe calling because of a crisis. And we'll go through a couple different ideas for crises as they'll be pertinent for this organization. Could be a cyber attack, could be a manhunt in the area, could be a lockdown on your campus, could have heard a 911 dispatch about a situation at your organization and they're calling to follow up with questions as some general ideas. So you're being brought into a media story or your organization has an issue. Let's take those two as our categories to talk about first. The number one thing I think, if there's a couple of top things I'd like you to walk away with, and one was the idea that the media is just doing their job. But the other is that you're not required to be an expert when the media calls and wants you to be an expert. You're not required to know everything the first time the media calls you. It's kind of unrealistic for you to know exactly what to tell them at their decision to call you. So I want you to keep in mind that you don't ever have to have immediate answers for the media when the media calls. Taking their call is a good first step because you may see it on caller ID. But then you want to take a step back and recognize that you're, again, that relationship and there's no need to advance that immediately. So your job is to get the answers after you've talked to them and then get the answers back to them. Get the answers internally from your organization and then give them back to the media in a timely manner. So how to go about doing that, some recommendations. Again, sorry, I have a couple of notes here that I'm following along. My first recommendation is a deep breath and to think about yourself taking a little bit of control of the situation, to not feel like you're at the mercy of their phone call and of the pressure that a reporter is going to be putting on you, because they often are, making it sound super important, like I was, to the people I was calling. It's really important. It's not so important to you, though, maybe, so you don't need to feel their pressure. What I'd recommend is that you tell them that you are happy to take their phone call. You're happy to take the questions they have and write down their questions and have them be very specific about what questions they would like you to go find the answers to. That works really well. It buys you a little bit of time to go have other conversations and to be realistic about how you're going to answer these questions, and it doesn't put you under the pressure to do anything right then. You're also being respectful of what they're asking of you. And so having a discourse where you take a little bit more control of the situation, remain polite and respectful, recognize they're doing their jobs, and take their questions from them. From there, take their name, ask their name, their phone number, their email, their deadline, depending on what type of media it is. It could be a magazine with a deadline of 2 weeks. It could be TV with a deadline of 3 hours. So just fielding out, the reality of getting back to them as well, and making sure you have all that squared away during that first phone call. So after they call, are you calling them back or are you emailing them back? And what are you going to do with a couple of questions that maybe you don't want to answer? Those are some tough things to kind of toss around. Let's start with, should you call back or should you email back? Sometimes it's basically a judgment call. I think both are respected in the world of media relations, and it could be dependent on your workday and things like that. But if you're giving it thought to what you actually want to do, I'd say it's topic dependent. The more sensitive the content that you'll be discussing with the reporter, the more controlled I like to be with my information in that area, and then I lean a little bit more towards email. If it's a reporter that I know who's easy to talk to and I've worked with before, maybe I'm going to move more towards phone call because I haven't talked to you in a while and I'd like to say hi. If it's a reporter that I know everything I say is going to be on the record, maybe I'm going back to email again. So you're just kind of feeling out what's best in that area. A couple of things to keep in mind, though. One of them is that the most important thing of sharing that information is that making sure it's accurate information and that you feel competent, the reporter knows what you're trying to tell them. So that's going to trump any decision-making on phone call or email. There's often times where you may get the feeling based on email, the reporter's not asking the right questions, they don't understand the situation, and in that case, I'm going to need to make a phone call and make sure we're very clear about details. So that's going to trump everything in deciding email or phone call, making sure that the information you want to share is being accurately reported to the reporter. I think we all realize that the first time that story goes out on the news, it gets the most views And even if you get it fixed later because they mess something up in reporting, it never catches everybody. And so getting that first, and the reporters are not going to let you go see the version of what they wrote, so you're not going to know how they received the information you gave them. So you're going to make sure you're as clear, comprehensive as you can be when you're answering their questions. And recognize that you're giving your story to someone else to be now the owner of. And so being clear about your information so that no matter what they choose to quote or use would be applicable to the entire story. All right, so what if there are questions that you don't want to answer that the reporter asks you? I've never actually seen no comment successfully ever used. So I often hear people say, well, they tell me I'll just call, what they call, I'll just say no comment. I never recommend saying no comment. It never gets skewed positively for you by the media, so we should just kind of set that aside and try to explore what you could actually comment when asked questions that you don't want to answer. So a couple of things to think about. It's not really a reasonable response to say no comment, especially if you also context in social conversations nowadays and how much conversation is happening. It's kind of unrealistic to think an organization can't come up with something to say about a situation that is ongoing. So you want to leave that idea of no comment behind, and then you have a couple of options from there. If they ask a question and you just blatantly don't answer it, you run the risk of them saying, and I asked the Archdiocese this, but they didn't answer. Sometimes that's just the best you're going to do, and you'll know it going in, and that's going to be fine. Sometimes they're going to ask that, and you legitimately, it's not a question that I can answer. That's the best I've come up with instead of saying no comment. It's a little bit more truthful. It has a little bit more, I'd like to be able to do what you're saying, but I just can't, or I just don't know the answer, or it's just unrealistic for me to find that answer right now. So I've only had to use that myself twice. So, it's not frequently. You're going to want to come up with something if possible. Another strategy would be maybe try to avoid answering the question by offering something else that's kind of like that question. I'm not here to smear around public relations work or make it something it's not, but the reality is that they're going to ask questions that they just don't have the rights to know sometimes, and you'll have to be forward about that sometimes, but you also could play around by offering them other things that helps illuminate what they're asking without being specific about answering what they're asking. So those are some strategies if you don't want to answer the question or can't answer the question to think about. So those questions that can't be answered from a legality standpoint are pretty frequent as well. I think that today's idea of social media, where everybody's commenting about everything and everybody thinks they have the right to know everything all the time, and we're used to lots of information input, is a tricky slope when you're working in public relations, because you don't want to defame someone's character. That's not what the church teaches or what good ethics and journalism we would want to be doing. We don't want to get into personnel matters. It's a bad idea for human HR reasons. There may be an open police investigation. There may be legal processes in work. There may be civil lawsuits happening right now. There's all sorts of reasons. And for those areas, we do not comment on personnel matters. And to some capacity, reporters just have to take that. And we do not comment on pending litigation. Those do get used pretty frequently, because even though the reporters know we're not going to comment, they're still going to call to say they called, and we're still going to have to say that we don't comment. So I don't know how applicable that is for religious orders, but it is something to keep in mind if you run into a tricky spot. One of the things I keep up on my wall, because it does come up pretty often, where they ask questions that, I can explore it to some capacity, but I can't give you the full answer to what you're hoping I'd be able to tell you. And so this is one of the quotes we're going to talk through a few of the other kind of resources or things I lean on for my personal work. But this is one of the quotes I leave up on my wall at work. If the questioner does not have the right to be informed, then it becomes the task of experience and prudence to find the proper way of avoiding an answer. kind of like that avoiding an answer at the very end, because I think that happens at times. That is from a book by Romano Guardini, Learning the Virtues That Lead You to God. And prudence is a cardinal virtue. It's using practical reason in a concrete situation, and the wisdom to kind of discern what exactly to do in that scenario. And I think that's very applicable for media relations. Okay. So if the media calls with an interview request for an established story, so that may be something, it's not really breaking news. Maybe it's just one news outlet or newspaper that wants to cover this, and they had a wild idea that day, and your organization would help them tell that story. So they're calling you, kind of like the snowy owl again. So those kind of phone calls, the phone calls before were, they heard you on the scanner with a problem at your office, and they wanted to catch you on record in a phone call. These are a little bit more not on the record usually if the media is calling you. You got a little bit more lax. They're calling for something, maybe they want to come tomorrow to interview you, something a little more casual. These stories, or maybe it's slightly serious. I'm recollecting a couple examples in my head of where maybe you had a situation a while ago and they want to follow up on it again. It's a story they've been running for a while. Before we kind of weighed email or phone call, with this one you kind of want to weigh whether you'd accept that interview based on if you need your voice in the story, or sometimes we already have, as communicators of our organization, we've already got our message out there already, and we don't necessarily want to give our message to somebody else to do something with. So these are phone calls quite often in my role in media relations for the Archdiocese. I work for the pastoral center doing public relations work for the diocese itself, but then I do consultative work for the schools and the parishes that run into situations where the media is calling, or parents are threatening to call the media, or those scenarios. And so this is the kind of the conversation, one of them that we have often, is I would empower you and I will support you to do that interview, but I'd ask you to consider, do you want to give your story to the media to have a voice in that story? Could be important. Or do you think that you've already got your message out there strong enough that you don't necessarily need to participate in that interview, and kind of thinking that through. So those are kind of some of the questions in that area. If you do decide you'd like to do an interview with the media that's maybe established for down the road for a story that they're working towards, I think it's important if you ask the reporter to be as specific as possible of what the aim of the story is. Sometimes we get these vague emails from media saying, hey, I have this idea that I'd like to, they don't sound reputable, and they're looking for what's new in your organization. You're kind of tipped off in the back of your mind like this doesn't quite feel right. So you want to pursue that quite a bit to find out what the aim of their interview is. Ask them if they have any prepared questions ready that they're thinking about, they're trying to get out of the interview. Again, the deadline, expected length of time for that interview. And then I have found that if you do that in phone call, it feels a little less intense than on email when you're firing off 18 questions for the reporter when they're supposed to be interviewing you. So just a thought of, I usually recommend doing those type of things in phone calls if a media interviews or calls requesting for an interview. So what to do when the media shows up on your property? This one comes up pretty frequently, it feels like. I don't know that people often realize that you don't have to necessarily entertain them on your property. But you want to think through how you're going to disinvite them from your property if that's what you choose. So you have private property, so they don't have to be on there, but they're just going to go across the street and then shoot your property from across the street. So you're just kind of weighing that idea of letting them on or not letting them on. Are they interacting with people on your property? You don't want them to, maybe you want to get off. Are they just going to go across the street and get the same shot? Maybe you could just stay there. If you go out to talk to them, are they going to try to talk to you then? Should you send somebody else out to talk to them so that it's somebody they wouldn't interview? It's kind of something to play around with. I mean, hopefully nobody has these major issues, but just to have thought through this before it happens, or to know somebody to call if you want to have a conversation before it happens. I'd be happy to do that. But so keep that in mind when and if that becomes a situation for you. So what do you do when the media calls and you're in a crisis? Maybe there is a lockdown or a cybersecurity situation or something serious going on at your organization. So when in crisis, you'll know why the media is calling, first tip, and maybe you don't want to take that call until you do have an idea of what you're going to say. At that point, you can't really say, now tell me your 10 questions and I'll write them down. That's not probably going to work out as well. So if you're in a crisis and they call, whatever you say first is going to be your first response statement, is what we'd call it professionally. It's going to be the first thing that you're publicly saying. So a few things to think about before that happens. And this is, again, where we talked to a lot of schools and parishes that run into these things. You want to breathe and not panic. Engage your allies. For you, I'd assume that's your provincial or your superior, your directors, your human resources, possibly your legal, possibly law enforcement. You're being honest with the facts of the situation are, the facts in your organization, how you professionally, honest with yourself about handling it, if you need help or you don't need help. You want to think about your important stakeholders, those people that need to be communicated to about your crisis. Maybe it's the residents or the religious order members at your organization, the staff or faculty, possibly the community surrounding your religious order. Anything that you write in a crisis is going to be considered public from the get-go. So again, that first emergency draft statement would be anything you put up on social media that's going to be an official statement from you, whether you want it to be or not. Or an email you send to one religious member, they get screenshotted and then shared on Facebook and then shared over here and then it's on the news. So just keep in mind whatever's written quickly should be able to withstand public scrutiny. So anything communicated is your first response statement when you are in a crisis. The goal would be that you'd work with your communication director yourself and your other leaders to craft what your first response statement should be. You want to inform your audiences that you're aware of the incident, whatever it is, what you're doing about it, and that they can rely on you for updates and information. And again, hopefully nobody here really has this, has to go put this into practice anytime soon, but I think it's good to at least start to think through a little bit of how we'd handle these situations. Your first response statement, what you know, do not say we have no comment or act like you don't know anything. Describe what you're doing to address whatever the situation is. State the obvious. Sometimes it's real when you're writing communication, it's so easy to talk around the most obvious thing. No, people want to know, are their kids safe? People want to know, is the religious order, is everyone safe? Saying those very obvious things. Make sure you're emotionally intelligent and compassionate. Let people know you'll continue to communicate with them, and then where they can find more information in the meantime if there's going to be more things posted publicly. My boss used to worked in communications. I'm the director of media relations. He's the director of communications for the Archdiocese, and he's come out of a 35-year career in communications, more in the branding side, but he has attended lots of workshops and is very professional experienced. And he brought this to us as we began working together 5 years ago with how we'd start to think about crisis communications. And it stayed with us. It's on each of our boards to think about. I don't know that we stand by it definitively, but he learned in his career that at Disney, Walt Disney World, their communication model, they used what was called the last model, where they listen. Sometimes people just want to be heard. They apologize if necessary. I'm sorry is a powerful phrase. They solve the situation, and then they thank people for bringing that to their attention. And I think that's a good framework to be thinking about if you're needing to write crisis communication information. A couple of considerations when in a crisis, and again, this goes back to kind of if you're in a moment of crisis and you've never dealt with this before, I think people's minds kind of go to pretty quickly, what if this turns into a media nightmare? What if we get canceled? What if socially or online? What if this becomes a disaster? And they may start to think that way instead of pausing to think that virtuous decision-making is a much higher priority than worrying about the effects of what's happening socially. So if your organization is seeking the truth, is learning to find out exactly what happened with the facts and the details, they're committed immediately to finding justice for what's going on right now. If there is a problem, how do we need to solve this? Who needs to be contacted? And then if they're committed to communicating with those stakeholders or important community members, those are the things that an organization needs to be thinking about, and not necessarily, what if this becomes a disaster suddenly in the media? So I highly recommend stepping back and thinking through those things first. A couple of resources if you'd like to explore more in the field of crisis communications, because this was obviously very minimal. If it becomes applicable, consider hiring a communication firm to assist. We've at times consulted with communication firms for different scenarios. Outside eyes can be really helpful, or outside perspective can be very helpful. You can prepare yourself by attending public workshops. They do have crisis management workshops that are not just for like first responders crisis, but for communication means. Building peer relationships with consultants. And then I also brought, I'm a big reader, so I like to read to get caught up to speed. One of the books that I attended a workshop by Melissa Agnes, and then she has a book called Crisis Ready that's very, very good for organizing for preparation for crises. And maybe not like wildly applicable to maybe the church world, but there's definitely some things you can pull from if it's an area that you're being tasked to learn more about or be ready for. Let's see. So after the media's covered your story, whether it's a crisis, not a crisis, something you've asked them to cover, whatever it is, I highly recommend going and finding that media coverage. You could ask the reporter to send it to you. That's usually acceptable in the field, that's fine. Or you can go find it yourself. And review all the coverage and assure that it's accurate. Even if you're going to get an update to the coverage, sure, it won't get everybody's eyes, but it's going to go down and get used later and get reviewed again and again. So you want to make sure whatever the media does cover is accurate. If you need a clarification or correction, those two words, they take them very seriously when you call the media. A clarification would be, could you flush that out a little more? If you call for a correction, they get a little bit on the weirded side because they really don't want to get things wrong sometimes. So just be careful of your word choice when you do that. And a phone call to the reporter you worked with is a good idea, or an email to the newsroom, being very specific of what you need corrected factually that's been covered by the media. My general media philosophy is if we do the right thing, we have nothing to hide. So if we're living out our Catholic faith in a virtuous way, obviously I can't control anybody else's actions, but we can all collectively be working to do the right thing, then there's nothing, the media can call for whatever they need, and we'll always have answers for them. And the other idea that I often stand behind is we can control our actions, but we cannot control the media. I can't control if they're going to decide to cover that story or not cover that story. I can only control my contribution, my conversation, my effort to go learn the truth, my decision if I'm going to give an interview or not. But they still may decide to cover it, even if I think that's never a story. Why are you making this up? I can't control their actions. Some of the things to think about for the internal work in media relations, having not studied media relations or worked in the field until coming out of television, it was kind of a learn-as-you-go scenario. This was the job that I stepped into at the Archdiocese was not a job they had before. So they created the job. There was no one to learn from previous to my work there. But something I've learned over the years of working in the field would be establishing yourself as trustworthy and professional in the office goes a huge way, a long way for being able to have the difficult conversations you may need to have, to learn difficult details, to engage professionally with members of the media, to earn respect outside the office as well. I find it important not to seek out information for entertainment. There's lots of things going on in the office. I could go try to learn all of them because I might need to know, but I don't need to do that for entertainment reasons. Be willing to work. There's a lot of research and a lot of fact-checking when these phone calls start coming in from the media. I don't necessarily need to just trust somebody else to tell me those answers. I'm going to look for that final document that I see it in writing, that I know that that's what we did before I go say my name, that that's what happened, because I don't want my name associated with a lie at all. So be willing to do that. Long hours. Media deliverables, something to think about of the media calls. Could you start to brainstorm what else they may need that could be helpful? You could provide to them maybe some documents that would be helpful that's like, you know, on the very back end of your website, that's a downloadable that they don't even know you have. Well, you could go, you know, source that up and provide it ahead of time. You could provide them with photos. Maybe you know they're doing a story about a certain priest. Maybe you have a stockpile picture of that priest or religious sister to get them moving ahead of time, to offer to try to make their load easier. Having come from that side, I know all the stuff that that we would need every day to make those stories happen, and so trying to deliver those ahead of time could be super helpful. Another one of the topics I wanted to talk about today was participating in social conversations. We get a lot of input at the Archdiocese level, and I would think you would at the religious order level, of something's happening nationally or globally, and are you guys commenting about it? Does your religious order have anything to say? Are you putting a statement on social media? Are you putting a statement to the media? And the question that we've come down to in our office, my job's often, I find it beneficial, and just 2 cents worth of advice, that it's myself and then the director of communications, and we kind of play off of each other, where we're going to challenge each other whether we should or should not, comment on a social conversation. It's not just a single person making a decision and then pitching it to the Archbishop. It's us challenging each other and exploring what those things would be. So one of the kind of final where we've come to deciding how to handle social conversations, because when the war in Ukraine happened, we get a phone call from the media. What's your comment on that? Are we commenting? Or for that one we did, but there's plenty of other things that we don't. So we ask ourselves, are we adding fuel to the fire, or are we helping to illuminate understanding of the situation? That's kind of our base level begin to process if we should participate in a social conversation or offer a public statement about a social or global situation. A couple of considerations after doing this for a little while as we explore the answer to that question and think of it honestly, again, being honest with ourselves. Are we making a statement as a desire to be part of the conversation? If so, is that because we desire to be noticed? Is that because we don't want to be left behind and not have said something? Is it our own ego that wants to participate in that conversation? Is a statement a means to benefit ourselves or our own agenda? Are we actually trying to use that social situation to benefit something else we're doing? Something else we're communicating right now? Could that benefit us? Again, back to ourselves. Is this about ourselves, or is this really about that social situation that we would, if you're going to offer to illuminate a situation, you'd be offering to shed new light on it to help people see it in a more honest way. And so you're going to need to be honest about why you're participating in commenting on a social situation. Are we making a statement to appease people who are bullying us to comment? When's the Archbishop going to say something? Has the Archbishop said anything? When is he going to say? What does he say? We get that a lot, and maybe you do too, in consideration of, are you just appeasing that they want you to comment and giving into that? So, again, those 3 questions, we explore those, and if it's yes to any of those questions, we do not generally make a statement about that social conversation. So that means, that we're not participating in public media statements or social media statements. So that takes me towards the very end here of the presentation, which is some of the faith-based thought process of this work. This is a question that I toy with as I come into work most days. Is this the work that, as I say a prayer to the Lord to help me with my work, is this help me to make the work for your glory and for what you desire for me to be doing and not work for me? It's a tough discernment each day of, am I doing the work for any self-gratification or so that we look good, or humanly reasons instead of the divine work that I pray the Lord is using me for. So I think it's a good point of reflection in all the communication that we write on behalf of the Catholic Church and our religious orders, to discern if we are honestly working to build the kingdom or working to build ourselves. And so the consideration for that. And finally, I brought with me some of the books that I most frequently use or reference. As I mentioned, I'm kind of a reader. I like to read a lot. And these kind of have a sparked assistance for me in my work. The first one's the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Very specific language the Church uses, very specific definitions and explanations and questions that you need to answer at times. And everybody speaking from the truth of the Catechism is a great idea. So I'm using that all the time. Let's see. I brought the other books just for fun. The next one is To Light a Fire on the Earth. That's Bishop Robert Barron, who not only obviously writes, but he has podcasts and videos and social media content and blogs. And but a number of years ago, it's not super old. I'm not super old. But this is one of the first, I think this is the first book I had by him, To Light a Fire on the Earth, which is just a great introductory place of proclaiming the gospel, and a good, I think he's great at taking the faith and distilling it into a consumable and exciting reality for us to then share with the rest of the world through our evangelization, our work, our communications. And then the next one is In Heaven and on Earth. That's the Latin translation. I don't even know how to say that in Latin. 365 Days with the Saints by the Daughters of St. Paul. It's excellent, and it's beautiful, and it feels nice, and it has great pictures, and each day it sets the stage of the intimidation of the work of the saints and the aspiration of striving to, in some capacity, continue their mission. So I love that book, and the one I already quoted earlier, Learning the Virtues That Lead You to God by Romano Guardini. And he was a papal consultor back in like the 50s and 60s at the Vatican, and is extremely consumable as well, but writes in such a knowledgeable place. And he writes about a dozen virtues here, which is a wonderful book. So I recommend that as well. That concludes everything I prepared to present, but I'm happy to take any questions. I will not be able to stay after my presentation in the hallway because I unfortunately have an appointment I can't miss. But if anybody has any questions now, I'd be happy to answer. Sure. So she's asked if, is it acceptable that maybe all calls get deferred to a certain location? The way we handle it, so if a school or a parish has a situation going on that they know they're going to be getting media calls, I call ahead of time and say, I'm here simply as a resource. So they have the rights to take their own calls or to do whatever they'd like with ownership of their own situation. But if it benefits you or if I could be of help, you're welcome to just do that. So for the most part, the way we operate is almost every school and parish will just say, media calls are being referred to Jennifer at the Archdiocese. And it opens them up to spend that time thinking about making good decisions and what their steps are without worrying about the pressure of media phone calls. So, I don't know the inner workings of how your religious orders work, but maybe you have a national public spokesperson who's willing to be that person if people are calling you and you have a crisis and you can defer to them. But then you're going to need to make sure you're in communication with that person so they know what to say in time. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, we also do a similar, if we know it's a specific issue or if it's going to be like a bomb for 2 days, you know, we write up a little script that says, thank you for calling. We understand that you have concerns and would like some answers. Media calls are being sent to, and then we get to everybody who answers the phone in the building. Like as a reminder, you know, maybe in your policy, but it's always kind of nice to remind them too when they have that pressure at that moment to take that call from the media. That's a good idea. Yes. Sure. We have some general drafts of different types of scenarios that we also default to. I've actually found, though, the first couple of years, every time I drafted, like, this would be our statement, by the time the media actually calls, I know 10 more things, and then I've actually, so it's been interesting how that works out, but at least gets you in the right space. And I have, like, it in hold, in, like, the hold folder on my computer, if I need it. Yeah. I don't know what time it is. We just have 1 more minute, so yes. Great. They're in the app. Don't go share them with all your reporter friends. That was the only thing I was slightly nervous about. If they get wind that I'm telling you guys all these things, they might not like me anymore. So, no, I don't think that'll end up in their hands, but yeah. Okay, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it very much.